Okay, thank you. So first, everybody, we would like to begin by acknowledging with respect that we are in Treaty 3 territory and that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Métis people. So my name is Marshalina Reeder, and I'm here today with my colleague and co-host Tyler Peacock, and we are also joined by our youth service learning and leadership intern, and we would like to extend a warm welcome to Abigail and also the students who are joining us today, Andre and Ethan, who are students of Dr. Donev. We'd like to thank all of these folks for taking the time to join us, and we're truly grateful for the opportunities to continue learning with all of you. The presenters made themselves available so quickly, and we really appreciate their willingness to support the requests for information that have been submitted by Dryden and area stakeholders. So we just extend a warm welcome again to everyone. We would like to remind people that this event is an extension of our workspace, and we require the same courtesy, respect, and considerate conduct as we would in our regular work environments. As such, any person engaging in comments or conduct that is in violation of the city's standards will be supported to leave the session. We really do want everyone involved in the conversation. However, the discussion can very quickly lose its meaning if any unnecessary or negative remarks are made or directed at any person or group. So we just, we appreciate that we have had events very successfully in the past where this has for the most part been followed. So we just thank everybody for choosing to support that kind of conduct. So now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Donev, Kimberly, and Larkin for introductions and to introduce their agenda for today.
Kim, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks. My name is Kimberly Mitchell. I am a member of the Halibu Mi'kmaq First Nation, which is a First Nation located in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I have 2 degrees in mechanical engineering, and so my background is technical in nature, and I've worked in the energy sector and the pulp and paper industry for over 20 years, and I'm very happy to be working once again with the City of Dryden.
Hi everyone, my name is Larkin Mosscrop, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Regina studying nuclear acceptance and education. And I also work at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. Today, I am not here representing Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, however, just as someone who is interested in nuclear and engaging with communities around nuclear science and development.
Okay, I'm Jason Donev. I teach at the University of Calgary. I'm a physicist by trade and training. I got my PhD from the University of Washington, and then I started teaching at the University of Calgary 13 years ago. And I was brought in to teach nuclear power because I thought Alberta was going to get nuclear power. I'm the sort of person who will deliberately move to where there is nuclear because that's the sort of place I want to raise my family. And I've got a couple students here today. Ethan, you want to introduce yourself real quick, and then Andre?
My name's Ethan Beckler. I'm a student by trade and training, but I am a very particularly focused student, especially when it comes to energy science and nuclear in particular. And I've been working with Jason on adapting his courses for Indigenous perspectives.
Okay, and I'm Andre Rodriguez. I've been a student of Jason's for, give or take 6 years now. Finished a renewable energy degree with him and now finishing a physics degree. So we'll see how that goes. And had my hand in the nuclear industry for a few years now.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you very much for inviting all of us out. The plan for the day is I'm going to give a little bit of background and context on sort of nuclear science and technology in the world today and in Canada specifically. Larkin is then going to talk about various organizations. It can be very confusing. There's a lot of different organizations, a lot of different players, and it's easy to get them confused. I know when I came to the Canadian nuclear industry, I would regularly confuse a number of things. And then Kimberly is going to talk about her experience and perspective as somebody who has spent a lot of time in Northern Ontario and in the nuclear industry, talking a little bit about the engagement process and so forth. So I'm really looking forward to hearing that presentation as well. We'll then break out into breakout groups. There's going to be roughly 30 of us. So we're going to have small breakout groups, and each of the 5 of us who just introduced themselves are going to go from breakout group to answer any individual questions and just have a chance for conversing. I find Zoom meetings work better when people don't have to just sit there passively and listen the whole time. So if you do have questions, you can ask them in real time in the chat. If the person presenting, though, will probably not be able to actually field questions. It's one of the reasons the students are here to help with that, but other presenters can also field questions. Barring any housekeeping concerns, I'll go ahead and get started, but anything before I start that?
No.
All right. So, when I came to the nuclear industry as a physicist, I was really surprised by how much I didn't know about nuclear. And, you know, I kind of felt like I should know about nuclear. I've watched The Simpsons, and clearly The Simpsons couldn't have gotten it all that wrong. And I was surprised and even shocked to discover that even among people who believe that they understand about nuclear, there's often a fair amount of misinformation because there's just so much misinformation floating around. The internet has made it possible for a whole lot of information to get out there without necessarily a lot of filtering. And I was terribly amused that I had thought it was Mark Twain who said a lie can get halfway around the world before truth can get its boots on. But it turns out that while Mark Twain may have said something like that, Hayden Spurgeon actually said it quite a bit before Mark Twain could have. So we'll talk a little bit about nuclear in context, some myths about nuclear, some realities of nuclear. And to be clear, I do not work for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. None of the guests here today work for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. I'm a university professor who teaches about nuclear. I started off as being very anti-nuclear. The more I learned about nuclear, the more I discovered that a lot of my fears were based in the myths rather than the realities. So the overview of my talk, which is going to be about 30 minutes, is nuclear science and radiation in Canada. It's useful. I'm going to talk about what that means specifically. Then whenever humans do things, nuclear science and technology being no exception, it creates waste. And with that waste, there are potential risks. And we want to talk about what's different about nuclear than about certain other wastes. Now, because we have waste and the waste does have potential risk, we need a plan. So because we needs a plan, we needs to have a plan. We have a plan, and that plan has been put into place, but it's unfolding still. So part of this plan involves finding a specific place for the spent nuclear fuel. And there's also other things as well. We could talk about that if that's of curiosity here. But that's the overview of what I'm going to talk about. So radiation myth. This is definitely, as a kid growing up watching Godzilla, I thought that radiation was destructive, incomprehensible, and extraordinary. I didn't think it was something that we dealt with on a day-to-day basis. I didn't think anybody understood radiation, and I thought it only did harm. I've come to understand that radiation is actually a life-saving thing. As somebody whose family has been touched by cancer in the past year, I've got to say that I'm really grateful for all of the nuclear work that has been done in Canada to do things like fighting cancer. It's indispensable. It's used in a wide variety of ways that we just don't ever think about. It is fascinating. It is something that my students often come in going, okay, yeah, I guess I'll learn a bit about this. And over time, a lot of my students get really, really excited learning about radiation, nuclear science, and technology, because we are using it in our everyday lives. This everyday life is often invisible to us, like the radiation itself. We often don't see all the ways in which we're using nuclear science and technology. So going really, really dramatic to start with, technetium-99 is essential for medical and imaging. When I say essential, millions of people are getting technetium-99 images. And Canada has been one of the biggest producers in the world of technetium-99. Labs, well, Larkin could talk more about this than I can because she actually works at the place where they had this. Now, there was a reactor that, because it was so old, it got shut down. This has caused a technetium-99 shortage. Canadian scientists, Canadian engineers, Canadian technical people are currently working at new ways of trying to make technetium-99 because this isotope is used in the vast majority of radio diagnostic procedures. So this is a way we can tell what's wrong with people in a very, very effective way, and it is saving a lot of lives. We don't have as much technetium-99 as we used to because we had to shut that reactor down. Nuclear science and technology has gone a long way towards fighting hunger. The ability to store food is something that humans have been working out various ways of dealing with for thousands and thousands of years. Cold pasteurization, the process of submitting food to radiation, keeps the food from growing. It kills insects, it extends shelf life, it reduces pathogens, it reduces the amount of time that food needs to spend in quarantine. So I'm a big proponent of fighting hunger, trying to make sure that we keep the amount of food we have going out to people and distributing it. And it turns out that the nuclear sector, specifically in Canada, has been absolutely essential for this radiation preserving food. Even closer to home, smoke detectors have a little tiny bit of americium-241, which is an element that gives off alpha particles. And the alpha particles in the ionization chamber. So we've got this ionization chamber right here, got a little battery. And what happens is the alpha particles actually go through, and if you have smoke, the smoke winds up stopping that current, setting off an alarm. So smoke detectors have a little bit of radioactive material in them, and those are saving a lot of lives. Speaking as somebody who has had a house fire, that's a funny story for another time, but I am really, really grateful that I have a smoke detector in my home. Going a little internationally, the sterile insect technique is a way of using radiation to actually stop insects from carrying diseases. You mass produce pests in captivity, then you expose them to radiation. That's what irradiated means. Irradiated means exposed to radiation. Radioactive means gives off radiation. Easy to get those confused. Irradiate the larvae so they grow into adults that can't reproduce. These are released as sterile insects into the environment, and they try to breed with the wild ones, but then no offspring happens. And because there's no offspring, that means that after a generation, you see a dramatic reduction in the overall pests that are spreading a lot of diseases that are killing a lot of people in the world. And of course, the piece that we're most concerned about here, and what we will be focusing on a lot, although I'm happy to answer questions about that other nuclear science and technology, radiation, nuclear science and technology is producing clean, reliable, affordable, sustainable electricity. So this is a way that we can, in Ontario specifically, 60% of the electricity is coming from nuclear power plants, and it's CO2 free. It's also free of NOx and SOx and things that cause acid rain, which was one of the big problems with the lakes, was the acid rain coming from all the coal-fired power plants. We're actually eliminating fish populations across Ontario and further east as well. So nuclear is producing a lot of electricity already, and it has been doing that for a long, long time. This was a decision that was made decades ago. All of the activities where we are using nuclear in science and technology will produce some radioactive waste. Human activity produces waste. When we are using nuclear science and technology, it produces radioactive waste. This means that unlike the irradiated, sort of like a flashlight shining on me, radioactive waste is like a flashlight itself in that it is giving off light. And it's a lot like giving off light specifically because it actually is, to some extent, almost exactly like light. It travels in a straight line and it can be blocked by something. Low-level waste either has really, really short half-lives. So if it has a really short half-life, that means you don't have to wait too long until it stops being radioactive. A lot of hospital waste is of that short half-life. As a matter of fact, most of the radioactive waste comes from hospitals in Canada and other countries. But because it has such a short half-life, we don't have to think about it in the same way that we'll have to think about spent fuel. Other low and intermediate level waste includes things used at power plants, things like gloves and mop heads and so forth. Intermediate level waste is actual components in the reactor, filters, resins, and so forth. That type of waste is not what we're talking about today, although I'm happy to talk about that kind of waste if there's questions about it. The waste that is being talked about in the context of the Deep Geologic Repository is the spent nuclear fuel. This is the component of the reactor that is actually giving off all of the heat to make all of that electricity. Spent nuclear fuel is considered high-level nuclear waste, and it must be handled differently than low and intermediate level waste. Now, there's this myth, like I said, when I came to the nuclear industry, this was something I had believed, that radiation will turn us into monsters. So Blinky the three-eyed fish from The Simpsons is indelibly etched in our consciousness, but there has never been any evidence of vertebrates changing their DNA as a result of being exposed to radiation in a way that actually manifests itself in its progeny. That's a really complicated way of saying we don't actually get three eyes from being exposed to radiation. The reality is we're naturally exposed to radiation all the time, and as long as the doses are low, there's no ill effects. When the doses are high, that's when we wind up running into problems. So as a friend of mine is fond of saying, it's the dose that makes the poison and the dose rate that makes the poison. One way or the other, it's not turning us into monsters. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this. I want to be clear that at sufficient levels, radiation is absolutely harmful to life, to people, to the environment. The challenge is we've got to make sure we keep it below the level where it's harmful. So let's put this into perspective. One of the things I've often heard is, who would ever want to have nuclear anything in their backyard? And my experience has been that many of the nuclear experts, in fact, most of the nuclear experts, are not only living next to nuclear power plants or nuclear laboratories like Canadian Nuclear Labs, but they're also raising their families there. I certainly would raise my family next to a nuclear power plant. And one of the reasons I understand that, one of the reasons I would do that is the dose from living next to a power plant is considerably less than the dose from a single chest X-ray. Oh, chest X-rays, that can be really scary. Well, it turns out that we're getting 6 times as much radiation just from space, but we're getting a little bit more from the ground that we're standing on. We are also ourselves radioactive. I have radioactive carbon and radioactive potassium inside of me that are giving me a certain radiation dose. Our bodies are capable of handling all of this radiation without a problem. It's very clear that at these low levels of radiation, we are not seeing biological effects. We're not seeing harm. At a higher level, roughly 5 times what we give ourselves, being in basements a lot, if you have the right kind of geology, radon gas can actually collect inside of your basement. I can certainly answer questions about radon gas if people have questions about radon gas. The research is a little less clear. Some people say that radon gas causes lung cancers. Other people are like, it causes lung cancer if it gets above a certain level. But for the most part, radon gas doesn't cause problems, but you can have certain circumstances where a lot of radon gas builds up. So that 2000 number, that's a real rough thing. But below that, we're really, really clear, things are fine. Okay, so our normal annual dose is roughly 3 times that radon number. So this is from all of the different things we come into contact with. So that number is about 6,000. The smallest dose shown to cause an increased cancer risk is roughly 100,000. So quite a bit above the normal annual dose. Does this mean radiation will never cause problems? Absolutely not. Radiation can cause problems, but it needs to be at a particular level before it starts to cause problems. When people are getting cancer treatment, some sort of radiation treatment for cancer, they often do wind up exceeding that, especially in very concentrated parts of their body. The details of this are beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. Happy to chat about this more in the breakout room though. Now, the next myth, which I have to tell everybody outside of your area, but I'm sure that those of you in Dryden are very aware that Ignace and Dryden and Wabigoon Lake are all in conversation about having a deep geologic repository. There is a plan. Now, here in Calgary, when I talk to people, they're like, oh, well, there's no plan for nuclear waste. Well, there absolutely is a plan for nuclear waste. You may not like the plan, but there is absolutely a plan. The reality is we are not doing like they did on The Simpsons. We're not just looking for some random place to bury green goo. It's not green goo. It's not random. And they are looking, but they're in conversation about it. They found a good place from a geologic standpoint. Is that going to go forward? That's actually for you to decide. Now, the reality is there are 2 deep geologic repositories being proposed, one for the low and intermediate level, which is not what we're talking about today, but I can answer questions about it if you have them, and one for the spent nuclear fuel, the high level nuclear waste. And at the moment, these 2 communities have been taken out and we're left with this region and down in the South Bruce region. Countries all over the world are doing this spent nuclear waste repository, this radioactive waste repository, and some of them are getting really pretty creative. For example, COVRA is the art and nuclear waste repository. So they've decided to take these 2 somewhat dissimilar things and create a repository. Now, a repository, according to the dictionary definition, is a place where things are stored. So it turns out, because you have to have this carefully controlled environment, it's a great place to store artwork as well as storing nuclear waste. Because if you store the artwork there, you know that the environment is going to be very, very, very carefully controlled. So they've decided to actually do this together. I don't know if this means that Dryden could get its own art museum. I don't know. You'd have to work with them on that. But they've done some really fun things where the building where this is being held started off with a really intense color. And over time, every 20 years, they're going to repaint it a lighter and lighter color as the material becomes less and less radioactive. And of course, E divided by C squared, that's the E equals MC squared thing. That just means that there's some mass inside that they're holding on to. Now, options for waste. When I last spoke a month or so ago, one of the questions that always comes up is, why don't we recycle? And the answer is, we absolutely can recycle nuclear waste if we develop certain technology. So certain Canadian companies like Moltex and Terrestrial are looking at new types of nuclear reactors that can, in fact, take spent nuclear fuel, put it into a new reactor and get more electricity out. The thing to remember is, if we do that, there will be waste on the other side. So even if we do the recycling, we absolutely still have to have a repository, okay? One way or the other, we have to have a repository. We can't get around that just by recycling the fuel. We can't avoid having a repository just by having these new next generation nuclear reactors. Are these nuclear reactors a good idea? It's absolutely, in my opinion, it's absolutely worth pursuing them. but they don't exist yet. They haven't been approved yet. So relying on that technology seems a little premature. Investigating that technology is absolutely something that should be happening. And the NWMO is on the board of directors for Moltex. So they are very much in on knowing how this technology is going forward, which is one of the reasons they've got adaptive phased management. They are totally on top of, if technology improves, we will make modifications as we go along, but we're always going to need to have a repository. So a short-term repository is where the spent fuel starts. So you take the, hang on a second, forgot to grab this. You take this, this thing that's about the size of a rolled up yoga mat or a fireplace log, and it comes out of the nuclear reactor. It is really hot to the touch. Like it would burn me to hold it like this. So we keep it underwater for about 10 years. Sometimes it's only 7 years, sometimes it's longer than 10 years. That radiation coming off from here heats the water, but the water, a few meters of water, is totally capable of stopping all of the radiation coming up from that. Remember, this radiation is an awful lot like a flashlight, and it can be blocked with mass, even air, but air doesn't do it terribly well. Water, it turns out, does a very good job of blocking the radiation. So that radiation heats up the water, that pool gets a little warm, and I have stood over spent nuclear fuel with a Geiger counter, and I get more radiation flying to Ontario from Alberta than I get standing over that spent nuclear fuel. It then goes into a medium-term repository, basically a large warehouse, and the radiation makes the containers warm to the touch. So I'm actually leaning against a whole bunch of these. One of these will fit, actually I think it's 2 of these will fit inside of one of these tubes. And then this entire thing fits inside of this entire thing. And the radiation does make the container a little warm to the touch. But you'll notice that badge that I'm wearing on my chest, that's actually measuring the radiation dose that I get. And the answer is I'm getting very little dose. It's measurable, but it's not at the level that's harmful. Now, going forward, there are 2 possible repositories, both of which have rolling stewardship. We both have some plan to carry forward who's in charge of this. The one that's referred to as rolling stewardship is the above ground repository, and the below ground repository, the DGR that has been proposed. I wanted to do a little compare and contrast between those. Let me just check the chat. Yes, please do feel free to post questions in the chat, although I might not see them, my students can get to them, as can the other presenters. So for above ground, often referred to as rolling stewardship, although stewardship is something that both sides do worry about. The expense means paying forever, paying until the plan changes, which is why they want to move from that warehouse into a deep geologic repository. When you actually run the numbers, if you have a below ground DGR, that's $36 that you have to pay for a person's entire electricity use for a year. So the actual cost of your electricity for a year is presumably a lot more than $36. In fact, the $36 has already been paid on people's power bills ever since nuclear started putting electricity onto the grid. When you have above ground, an above ground repository, the monitoring needs to happen forever, or at least until you change what it is you're doing. So this monitoring you have to have people watching the thing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, up until you come up with a new plan. With the below ground deep geologic repository, the monitoring is only needed until it's sealed, which is one of the reasons it's only $36 as opposed to having to pay forever. Now, above ground, access to people wanting to steal it needs to be controlled from many points. Doesn't mean it's easy. Don't get me wrong, rolling stewardship would be safe enough. I just think DGR is a better choice, but rolling stewardship, people would be able to control it from many points. But when it's below ground, you're going to have limited access because you're only going to be able to go in either by creating an entirely new mine, which would be really noticeable, or going in through existing sites. In terms of environmental exposure, the above ground you'd have to protect from the weather and events, which they're currently doing. We know how to do that, but that's one of the reasons it's more expensive to do it that way. So in terms of environmental exposure, there is more risk with the above ground rolling stewardship model, where below ground, it's protected by the ground and the ground keeps it out of the biosphere. So what's the expert opinion? It could be done for a while, but the experts agree it's no actual plan. So when we're talking about below ground, the expert opinion is that every country with spent nuclear fuel has a panel of experts recommending that we find a deep geologic repository. Canada has it easier than a lot of other countries. Our geology is superb. Our geology in Canada, specifically your geology in the outskirts of Dryden, has some of the best geology in the world for this. Other countries are jealous of how good our geology is for something like this. Now, the retrieval, which, there are perfectly good reasons why we would want to retrieve this if we develop that molten salt reactor technology I was talking about before with Moltex, where we can recycle the fuel. The retrieval from that is quite easy. And for the below ground DGR, it is relatively easy. It's not simple, but it's not that difficult up until it's sealed. After it's been sealed, it's going to be quite a difficult thing to do. So pros and cons of both. Could we do either? Yes. What was decided? What was decided was the right-hand one. And it wasn't just decided in Canada, it was decided by every country that has nuclear power, is at some stage of coming to that decision. So hazard is the potential.
Jason, there was a really great question in the chat about does the water have negative effects once radiation hits it? People in the communities are concerned about harming or affecting any water. And you touched a little bit on it.
This water or the water in the environment around the DGR?
Water, I'm assuming from the question that water in the environment surrounding the DGR.
That's an excellent question. And that is one of the things the NWMO is working very hard to make sure of. I have some slides on that are coming up shortly. Okay. So hazard is the potential to cause harm, while risk is the chance someone will be harmed. And we manage hazard to reduce risks. And as Larkin just grabbed from the chat, I'm sorry, I didn't see who it was in the chat who said this. Water in the environment is one of the hazards we need to manage. Well, the water itself isn't a hazard, but getting radioactive material into the water is definitely one of the hazards that needs to be managed. So how do they do that? Well, there are 5 barriers to manage the risk. And those 5 barriers are all about keeping it away from the water, all right? So the first barrier is you have a nuclear fuel pellet. So it's ceramic. It's ceramic, much like, say, this plate is ceramic. And in much the same way that if I put this plate in a sink full of water, the plate doesn't actually dissolve away. So the ceramic pellet is something that won't easily dissolve. Will it dissolve a little bit? Sure, it'll dissolve a little bit, but it won't dissolve much. It'll dissolve remarkably little, in fact, which is one of the reasons why ceramic is such a good material to start with, because you want to make sure this radioactive material doesn't get into the water. Second piece is the fuel bundle itself. So this fuel bundle has zircaloy. So these tubes are actually made of zircaloy. It's a zirconium alloy, sort of like the cubic zirconium that fake diamonds are made out of, although in metallic form. And this is, of course, also watertight. It keeps radon in as well. So the uranium will actually produce radon, which, as we said before, can build up and so forth. But they're actually sealing the radon in. So this is barrier number 2. And barrier number 3, I don't actually have one. These are called the used nuclear fuel containers, and they take 48 of these. So this is a family of 4 from Dryden's lifetime worth of electricity fuel. So if you have a family of 4, this is how much nuclear fuel your family needs for its entire lifetime. This is it, right? This is a very small amount of waste compared to the amount of coal that you would use, which is almost 1,000,000 times more. Okay, natural gas, same thing. It's 1,000,000 times more than the amount of nuclear we would use. It's quite a bit than the amount of solar waste that people would develop if they got all of their waste from solar. So, or from wind turbines, that's also more as well. Okay, so this is a stainless steel container. It's covered in copper, and that's once again to isolate it from water in the environment, which is then packed in bentonite clay. So it's sort of like kitty litter. And this stops the flow of the water. And you want to keep that from corroding the copper, to keep it out of the stainless steel, to keep it off of the zircaloy, to keep it off of the pellets where it's not really going to dissolve anyways. I'm fond of saying that the people in the nuclear industry are sort of belts and suspenders types of people. You know, if I wanted to keep my pants up, I would put on a belt and throw on suspenders. Well, when it comes to nuclear waste, it's like, and we're going to chain the pants on, and we're going to super glue them on. And it's not that I mind that they've over-engineered it. The only problem is it makes it look like this is so hard to manage, where it's really just, you know, hey, and we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this. And yes, we can, but it's an awful lot to keep water from happening. But a lot of these are superfluous. A lot of them are sort of extra. Then you bury the whole thing under 1/2 kilometer of solid rock. So when I talked before about limited access points, we've got shafts here and a ventilation shaft here. In order to get at this huge area where all of the spent nuclear fuel for all of Canada's nuclear history has been generated, it's all going to go in this one repository, either in Southern Ontario or in the area between Dryden and Ignace. It's sitting there, and it's just going to stay there. So to sum up, Canada has nuclear technology. Its waste must be managed. There is a plan. Whether you like the plan or not, there is a plan. Whether the plan works or not is going to depend a lot on what the community acceptance of it is. If they don't have a community that accepts it, they're going to have to go back and revisit their plan. So the question for you is, do you want your community involved in that plan? That is your choice. There are a lot of aspects to this aside from the technical ones. There's financial aspects, and what does this do to your local industry and tax base and so forth. There's a lot of non-technical aspects to this entire project, which you as a community should really sit and talk about. Hopefully, I've given you a broad overview of the Canadian nuclear technology. I'm excited about the nuclear technology, and I'm excited about this plan and project. But that being said, I don't live there. You do. You're going to have to make decisions as a community about what it is you want. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will just quickly look in the... Okay, Kim has written something about water. Okay, I will read that later, but for now, I will turn it over to Larkin unless anybody wants to pause me before I give this to Larkin. All right, do we want to take just a 2-minute stand up and stretch, or do you want to just launch in, Larkin?
I'm good to just launch in, I think. I do see a hand up though. So, oops.
Yeah, Larkin, maybe we can just pause for a quick second, just see if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions just at the end of Jason's presentation there. We'll give it, we'll just give it maybe 5 minutes or so. Cody, go ahead and unmute and go ahead with your question.
Yes, you said you were going to address the issue of water in a deep geological repository, but you didn't address it yet. Could you do that before we break out into groups?
Okay, so water exists in an environment. For example, there are a number of lakes in the Dryden Ignace area. The 5 barriers are about keeping the water away from the spent nuclear fuel to make sure that the spent nuclear fuel doesn't get dissolved in the water and then go out into the environment.
But over time, if the containers are breached and fissures allow for water to get through and radioactive nuclides do escape, and in all mines water exists, then would not water be an issue within the deep geological repository?
So this is not a mine. This is a repository. So in a mine, you're actually going into ore through a number of strata, specifically in the crystalline rock version of this, which is the one that's been proposed in the Dryden igneous area. That large rock that they're looking at putting this in does not have water in it.
How do you know that for sure at this point?
They've done boreholes. They've actually dug a hole in and looked.
Can you provide your source that says that there is no water at all coming into those boreholes?
The Nuclear Waste Management Organization. I've seen the boreholes myself. I mean, it's a large crystalline rock. Why would there be water in it?
There's all, okay, all right.
And then also, Dodie, I think it's important, Dottie, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, is also that there will always be environmental monitoring that happens around the structure. And so just like we have with our current waste management within Canada, is all of our sites have a lot of environmental monitoring to make sure that we see anything as it happens. However, water in this situation is very unlikely because, as Jason said, it's actually making a hole in an actual rock versus putting it in different strata. The borehole studies are available, I think, on the NWMO websites as well. But it's also of the geological kind of area. And this is one of the reasons that the NWMO 10 years ago, when they started the discussions with communities, had about 20 communities that were interested. And these 20 communities are now down to 2 based on these technical and community factors. So technically, the technical factor is very important for the NWMO. Obviously, we need a place where we have minimal risk and or limited risk and very specific geology in order for this type of repository. And so these 2 communities are the igneous Dryden area and then that the Bruce Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. But you have said that Donev has said that after monitoring and after sealing it, after sealing the DGR, it won't be monitored. So how are you going to know whether or not there is water in that area or that there are fissures or anything over the next hundreds of thousands of years? I mean, how do you know?
So, I mean, it's a reasonable question. There isn't water there now in much the same way that so you're familiar with porosity. Like if I have a sponge, for example, the sponge can actually have water transporting through it. But if I have something like this plate, there can be water sitting on top of the plate, but there isn't actually water in the plate itself. There just isn't space for it within the solid, right? Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't, because I mean, the copper containers, I mean, everything is man-made. Their corrosion can happen. We don't know what the chemical effects are going to be. The radionuclides that are in those fuel bundles are giving off constant heat. There's a lot of radioactive decay. I mean, all you can do is do some computer modeling, but can that last, thousands and thousands of years? Those are the results. Your presumptions may last that many thousands of years.
So we have actually looked at uranium in the ground to see how it behaves over the course of millions of years, much longer than the life cycle of this. So we can actually go into, say, a uranium mine and look and see how the water has moved through the uranium and so forth, and what how the stuff is dissolved within it.
But that's much different that's a huge difference when you're looking at, because the pellets that are in the fuel bundles, once they've gone through the radiation, the process of fission, and over time, I mean, they're porous. There's porosity there, so
there's porosity in what, in the pellets?
Yes.
I'm sorry, where are you getting that information from?
Dr. Gordon Edwards has a source that I can give you. But there's, you can't suggest that the ceramic pellets will not change in any way, shape, or form going through the fission process at such incredible heat. I mean, so anyways, I can send you that source.
But the fission process is stopped by the time we've buried it. So the fission process stops as soon as it comes out of the nuclear reactor.
Well, you did say that you could take a bundle out, and you said, and I'll quote your words, you said that, okay, here, it will burn me to touch. Well, in fact, it will kill you. If you were to take a nuclear fuel bundle out of a nuclear reactor, it will kill you. It's not going to burn you. It will kill you on that spot.
Depends on how recently, but right when it's coming out of the nuclear reactor, it is absolutely true. It will give off a radiation field that is fatal.
Yeah, so his point on that, though, was that coming out of a reactor, things are both actually hot to touch, because the expression we use is something's radioactively hot. And so it's not only radioactively hot, meaning that there are these very quickly decaying fission products and actinides, but then there's also actual temperature heat, which is why when it goes into those rod bays allow those really highly active actinides and fission products to actually decay away. And that's before they then move to their longer term storage options. And so that's what he was meaning, he wasn't meaning you could take it out of the reactor and hold it without dying. He was referring to there is both types of heat. And so just to clarify, if anyone did misunderstand that, no, Jason knows he can't touch a fuel bundle out of a reactor.
Mm-hmm. Although that is what he said.
So folks, I'm going to just, maybe Jody, this will be a great conversation point for your time in the breakout rooms, because we do have to move on.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else have a question before I turn it over to Larkin? Take it, Larkin.
Can you guys see my screen okay now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I was like, okay, well, here we go. So I'm going to talk briefly about the nuclear industry in Canada, because there's quite a few players. And as Jason mentioned, when you first enter the nuclear industry, or even when you start to talk about the nuclear industry, it can be confusing because almost everything has Canada or nuclear in it. So I'm going to start with two organizations that you may be aware of. These two organizations are the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and it's responsible for designing and implementing Canada's plan for the safe long-term management of used nuclear fuel. So as Jason mentioned, this plan is the adaptive phase management. But what I want to emphasize is that the NWMO is a not-for-profit organization that was established in 2002 by Canada's nuclear electricity producers in accordance with the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act. So this Nuclear Fuel Waste Act is what prompted the creation of NWMO. And so that was a regulatory requirement. And that's why the NWMO here is actually sharing a slide with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or the CNSC. The CNSC regulates the use of nuclear energy and materials to protect health, safety, security, and the environment. And it's there to help us implement Canada's international commitments on the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to disseminate objective scientific, technical, and regulatory information to the public. So the CNSC was established in 2000, which you might think seems a little late, but in fact, it replaced the Atomic Energy Control Board, which was founded in 1946. So the CNSC is established under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, and they report through Parliament through the Minister of Natural Resources. And so this is a separate regulatory agency that has no buy-in or acceptance to any of the utilities or any of the nuclear facilities within Canada, but they provide independent oversight and safety regulations across all of the sites. So when I refer to the sites, I mean these three. So Bruce Power, or four if you think about OPG. So Bruce Power, actually, interestingly enough, Bruce Power started back in 1960s when Douglas Point was built and placed into service as Canada's first commercial reactor. So it is actually over here. And this is one of the Bruce Power sites. And over here is Bruce A, and this is Bruce B, I think. And Bruce Power has 8 different units. The 8 units are divided into Bruce A and Bruce B. Douglas Point, which is that first commercial reactor, actually is now under the responsibility of Canadian Nuclear Labs, which I'll talk about later. Bruce A was established in the 1970s, and its operating capacity is 3,200 megawatts. And Bruce B was established in the next decade, 1980s, and it has 3,300 megawatts of capacity. So the total capacity of Bruce A and B is about just over 6,500. Now, Ontario, so this is the site, and this is actually the turbine hall within Bruce Power. So this is actually where the steam comes through and creates the electricity that then goes outside. Now, this site is one of Ontario Power Generation, so OPG, and the OPG has 2 nuclear sites. The first of which is Pickering, and there's 6 operating units. In fact, there are 8 units, but 2 were shut down in the early 90s, and they were just not restarted because of cost factors. It's been in service actually since the early 1970s, so these are fairly old reactors, and they're expecting to be decommissioned by 2028. Which is OPG's second operating site, has 4 operating reactors that are significantly larger, because with 4 reactors, their capacity is about 3,500 megawatts. And so they came in service in the early 1990s. So they're younger facilities relatively, and they are going under refurbishment. The total capacity that's provided by Ontario Power Generation is 6,600 megawatts. And then finally, we can't forget NB Power, New Brunswick Power, which has one solo unit. There it is right here. And this is Point Lepreau. This one unit began to be operational in 1970s, and it's actually gone through an entire retube. And so it's got quite a lot of life left remaining in it. And its capacity is only 660 megawatts. Now, as I said, that this is the turbine hall, this is actually just a mock-up of the calandria for them to be practicing their retubing exercises that they're doing in Darlington. And here is again those nuclear fuel bundles that Jason was talking about in rod bays. This is actually from Darlington. So as I said, I wanted to, I actually come from Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and this is CNL, is Canada's premier nuclear science and technology organization. It used to be called Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, but it has now transferred to Canadian Nuclear Labs. And what we do is we look at developing nuclear technologies for peaceful and innovative applications. So we use unique experiences that we have in creating the CANDU reactor, restore our environment, and we're working with medical breakthroughs and technologies. So some of the things that we do is, this is actually the old reactor. This is the top of reactor. I've stood up there several times. This is our National Research Universal Reactor that was shut down in 2018 just because of its life cycle. It hadn't been refurbished. And so due to costs and government decisions, it was shut down. It produced at one point almost all of the molybdenum 99 or technetium as Jason was talking about for worldwide, and it continued to produce cobalt up until the day that it was shut down. This reactor was used to actually do a lot of materials research, fuel research, and medical research throughout its life of about 60 years. So this reactor was a powerhouse of our facility, and it definitely is one of one of our capstones that we're hoping to have a similar research reactor in the coming years. Now, this is a picture of a hot cell. So we do a lot of material research to support waste management, but also our current fleet. So we do things like pressure tube burst tests, which allow us to basically show that the pressure tube, which is containing that fuel bundle inside the reactor, is meeting material standards. Now, the last picture is important because this is the nuclear power demonstrator. This is up in Rolfton, so just about an hour north of me right now in Petawawa. And that's the beautiful Ottawa River behind it. And this is actually currently currently being decommissioned. This was the training facility for almost all of the other reactors. And it was the first reactor that was the first CANDU that was built. So that's Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. And it is just the hub of our research in Canada. Now, these are when we start to go into all the other Canadians and nuclear being in the titles. So the Canadian Nuclear Association, so CNA, is the lobby firm for the Canadian nuclear industry since about 1960. And they work with the members and the communities of interest to promote the industry nationally and internationally. So this is to help bring awareness to government as well as to other communities about nuclear in Canada. OCNI, or the Organization of Canadian Nuclear Industry, was formed to promote companies in the Canadian private sector to engage in the supply of goods and services for CANDU. So that's the reactor that we developed here in Canada, actually at Chalk River Labs, and the light water reactor nuclear power plants in domestic and export markets. So they're basically our supply chain, and supply chain is a huge thing in Canada for our reactor support. And finally, we then have CANDU Owners Group, so the COG, which are basically the group of people who operate CANDU reactors worldwide, who share information and work together to develop solutions to unique problems. Now, there's three other things that I just want to mention. These are nuclear associations that you can actually be a part of as someone in a community of interest, or if someone that's just interested in nuclear science and technology or nuclear in Canada. The first is the Canadian Nuclear Society, which is the CNS. This society promotes the exchange of information on all aspects of nuclear science and technology and its applications. So it has to do with kind of promoting the science and technology and understanding of it. The CNS membership is intended for the individual directly involved with nuclear technology but they also are kind of expanding to do a lot of information exchange and engagement. So for example, over the winter, we were doing some Canadian Nuclear Society was giving little kind of coffee break sessions where we would discuss a topic. So for example, I gave a talk about risk perception in the classroom. Women in Nuclear is an organization that supports women in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math, but also as it relates to the nuclear sector. So it relates to kind of challenges that people may have in the nuclear sector, and then also providing support for women within the industry. It was created because, you know, as I'm actually a scientist too, I forgot to even mention that. But as a woman in science, you know, when nuclear was first starting up, and still today, engineers tend to be more like percentage-wise, more males. And so women can sometimes feel like they are stepping into an area that's not really meant for them. Funny story at Chalk River, because it was quite an old site. It started up in the 1940s. The female bathrooms had like a little lounge attached to them because the women didn't really socialize with the men. So the women would go to their bathroom lounge during breaks and lunch breaks. And so that's kind of why Women in Nuclear has started up to support women in the industry. And then finally, you have North American Young Generation for Nuclear. And this is an organization that promotes kind of youth being in nuclear, and also people who want to support nuclear and see the potential for it in helping with climate change. So the North American Young Generation for Nuclear and WIN are both organizations where they're supporting nuclear, but they're really supporting the workforce within nuclear. So those are the associations, and allows you to kind of get a general oversight of the area and what kind of players there are in the nuclear field in Canada. I just saw your message. Tyler, sorry, there was a power surge. Did I lose a lot of people?
I think most are popping back in right now, Larkin, or in and out. I'm not sure how widespread the power outage was. It was just brief on our end, but we do have a backup generator. So
okay.
That might be some of the reason why we are still online. We still have 17 folks in the presentation though.
Okay. Yeah, the big part is that there's a lot of players in the Canadian industry, and we definitely are working very collaboratively together, although we are independently regulated, and we all are, but like for Nuclear Waste Management Organization, our utilities all kind of pay into or feed into having this long-term solution for waste is really important for us. So I'm happy to take any questions during the breakouts, even about the nuclear industry, or anything that you guys are interested in knowing about, or anything that prompted questions while we were talking. If not, I will hand it over to Kim briefly.
Larkin, sorry, how many people on average, or do you have an estimate of how many professionals in Canada belong to these organizations? Like what kind of, how large is the network, I guess, is what I'm curious to know.
So I don't have a general number, but I can say that 70,000 people work in the industry. So for example, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories is about 3,000, Bruce Power is about 5,500, 6,000, OPG is quite large as well. And so 70,000 people work in the industry, either indirectly or directly through supply chain, yeah, and mining. So these are, and that's actually one player I didn't mention, which is Cameco. Cameco is out of Saskatchewan, and it is a mining company and produces uranium for our mining. For our fuel. These fuel then get made into fuel pellets and mixed with the ceramics, and we are able to use that fuel. So it's actually Canadian uranium that we are using as well.
And then I guess maybe Jason can pop in on this question. Like, what does post-secondary enrollment look like in the nuclear fields? Is there a trend? Is that trend being monitored? What does the funnel look like for employment long term based on that enrollment?
So with the 70,000 people who work in the nuclear industry, a lot of them don't have a specific background in nuclear. So you have a lot of tradespeople, for example. And when you have tradespeople who are working in the nuclear sector, you have electricians, you have plumbers, you have pipe fitters and so forth. And they get their, electrician certification, for example, and then they have to get additional certification through whatever company they're working for in order to be able to do that. So some portion of the nuclear industry's funnel is taking trained professionals that you have, firefighters, for example, and then giving them additional training to work in the nuclear industry. Within the post-secondary institutions, there's actually remarkably little. There is a lot of, so my students at the University of Calgary are not strictly nuclear students, they're energy science students who are studying nuclear among other things. McMaster has some stuff. A lot of that's research focused. A lot of the engineers are coming out of Ontario Tech, also known as the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, UOIT, depending on where you've heard of it from. I'll actually defer to Kim. I suspect she knows more about this than I do. So, Kim?
Yeah, I could actually talk all day about education and employment for the nuclear industry. So Tyler and Marcelina, if that's ever an interest, we could certainly have a follow-up discussion. To give an overview, operating nuclear facilities are very self-sufficient. And so they look for staff that are across the sector. Everything from food services to supply cafeteria service to tradespeople that you might normally think of, like electricians and boiler makers and pipe fitters. And there's also a lot of operating staff, so operating engineers or stationary engineers, for example. There's chemical technicians, there's radiation protection assistants, there's engineers, there's lawyers, there's nurses, there's snowplow operators. I could certainly keep going, but I would say if people have an interest in education, training, or employment, any aspects of that whatsoever, certainly in the breakout room, I'd more than happy to talk about it.
No, I think, you know what, Kim, that might be a future discussion in and of itself, as just a one meeting topic, to be honest. Because I think when we start looking at DGR and understanding what types of opportunities that brings with it as well, for all intents and purposes, I can't foresee there being a reason to have a different type of layout, right? Where much in the same way you explained, there are people who are driving snowplows, there are people who are cooking meals, there are people who are, doing trades types of jobs. So no, I think there's for sure an opportunity to talk about that further.
If I can clarify a point that I was trying to make earlier, and to riff on what Kim was saying, people in Dryden could certainly be employed within the nuclear industry if the DGR came to your area. It's not like you would have to go away to get a university degree in nuclear engineering just to work at the DGR. All of these jobs, the snowplow people don't have a special nuclear engineering degree from the University of Calgary on driving snowplows for a nuclear reactor. It's very much something that Dryden could participate in were it to come there. Kim, is that consistent with what you were?
Yeah, like from my own perspective, being from Newfoundland, and my husband's from Northern Ontario, and we spend quite a lot of time there. I see a lot of parallels between my home province and Northern Ontario. A lot of the work goes south. You don't have kind of the services that you would have widely available nearer to cities like London or Kitchener or Sudbury. And work tends to come and go, I'll say. Growing up in Newfoundland, nuclear wasn't even on my radar. As I mentioned, I have degrees in mechanical engineering. I assumed I'd end up in oil and gas. Most of my graduating class worked for oil companies in Houston. And it's almost by accident that I found myself in the nuclear industry. And so, when you start talking about project work in general, for me, it's about time to see some prosperity come to areas where maybe traditionally there's not been widespread employment, where you see more mills have closed down than you see being opened, sort of thing. But that's a very personal perspective that I have.
No, thanks, Kim. Thanks. And if there's any other questions, feel free to ask folks. Otherwise, we'll jump into your presentation there, Kim.
Awesome. I will. You know, it's always, I always am very nervous when I do presentations like this because I'm coming as someone who's supposed to be a professional in the nuclear industry. And if I can't get my slideshow to work, that's kind of bad. So with my presentation, we're going to shift gears a little bit. I would like to round out the presentation element of this by talking a little about the social aspects of projects. When I was putting this presentation together, I was specifically thinking about resources relevant to fuel storage. However, a lot of the points that I raise are applicable to many different types of projects. And so I would encourage folks to really approach the presentation that way. Today, I will be touching on the topics you see here. We'll talk a little bit about culture and history, how those impact the way a community views a particular project. We'll talk about relations, business, and politics, and how those might influence the path of a project. We'll also touch on services. Then I have a section that focuses on consultation. Consultation is something I wanted to focus on because these are very regimented processes when it comes to do with anything energy related. In the case of the DGR, the regulatory authority will be the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. In Northern Canada, with small modular reactors becoming a thing, a lot of the mining companies are really excited about nuclear technology because of the opportunities it gives them to get off of diesel. And at the end, I want to highlight some sort of time relevant opportunities where individuals could get more involved in the conversation if they wish to do that. So as someone who has been very much involved in science, it even surprises myself that I'm giving a chat about social aspects. It's certainly not where I started out. I'm a very sciencey kind of person. And a number of years ago, I learned something very important from a friend of mine on Facebook. My friend lived near the capital city of Newfoundland, St. John's, and there was a story in the news that there was going to be some nuclear materials stored in a city facility in the town of Mount Pearl. And the reason that was notable for my friend is because when I read the article, it sounded really bad. And her immediate reaction was, this is so horrible. I can't believe the city is allowing this to happen in my community. And my response, which as I've reflected was not appropriate, was it's no big deal. It's just a nuclear gauge. The technical element of the situation was that road companies, and I want to say all road companies, but I'm always hesitant to go to absolutes. So companies who pave, they use nuclear gauges to measure things like the thickness of pavement that they've laid down or other characteristics of the road surface. So it's very common that nuclear gauges are present in communities. I know, for example, right now in the town of North Bay, there's a lot of paving and road construction going on, and almost certainly there would be equipment like that used regularly. And my friend, when I said to her, that's not such a big deal, what she heard was, I have a really serious concern and you think I'm overreacting. And it really damaged the relationship that we had. And so I took a lot of time to reflect on how people think about technology and how people kind of see the world around them and how they relate to it. And so social aspects have become a big part of how I approach my work. When we make decisions, a lot of, I want to say people, but I'm not sure that's the right word. A lot of people think that decision making is, as you see it on the right, very linear. We define our problem, we look at what we might do about it, we go through the pros and cons of each of those things, and the one with the most pros and the less cons is the one. That's what we're doing. And being able to go through a decision-making process like that makes us feel like we're in control, that we have an ability to make choices. And that autonomy is good for mental health, it's good for healthy communities, and just our ability to self-actualize as we go through our day-to-day lives. And what that means is, if someone asked you, are you satisfied with your life? You would generally say, yes, I am more or less satisfied. With decision making, there is this linear perception, and I'd like to talk a little about what decision making really looks like. When I started out in industry, I would go into the meeting with all the managers, and I would go there with my best logical case, because I'm a hugely logic-driven person. I try to make everything about logic in my life, whether personal or professional. And I would go there with these amazing cases of what we were going to do. And no one would ever agree to what I was proposing. And it probably took me 10 years to get an understanding of the reality of decision making. And that reality is that decision making is not a nice, neat, linear path. It's full of emotion, it's full of social pressures, there's incomplete information. You may have two bits of data that seem to be saying the opposite things, both seem to be correct, and you have no help or no resources to help you break the tie between those. A lot of the science, as it relates to nuclear technology, tends to be really complicated. 100 years ago, we were just really starting to get a handle on some of these processes. And in reality, even up until, in the last 20 to 30 years, we're still discovering new things in physics, things about how atoms work, how they relate to each other. And a number of years ago, you may have heard in the news that there was a new boson that was discovered. And my first reaction was, what the heck is a boson? And so some of these concepts are really, really complex, and they're very difficult to kind of put in that nice, neat box that we might want them to be in. When projects are going through a decision-making process, like what is happening with the Deep Geological Repository, they're impacted by a number of factors. So I live very near the town of South Bruce, which is one of the competing communities for the Deep Geological Repository. And so it's very interesting for me to participate in discussions in the area of the city of Dryden, because I see sort of the dynamics of the local community, and then I compare and contrast those with the things that people say and do in the Ignis area. And one of the drivers for that difference is the difference in culture and history. And in Northern Ontario, you do have some commonalities in that there are Indigenous communities in the vicinity. There are family history and structures that are being impacted. you have governments that have a similar structure. So you have that municipal level, the provincial level, the federal government. And in the Huron-Bruce riding, for example, it's been a very traditionally conservative riding. Whereas when you move to Northern Ontario, you tend to see less conservative representation in past elections. And that certainly has an impact on how constituents interact with their representatives in the context of government. You also see how differences in education and education availability impact what projects do. An interesting sort of anecdote from my own life. In Newfoundland, when I was growing up, there were two kind of main industries that were based in some biological and environmental processes. One was fishing and the other was forestry. And depending on where you lived in the province, you took either fishing or forestry in high school biology. And living on the West Coast in a paper mill town, we took forestry. And you learn things like how forests are managed, how paper mills work, how growth management works. You learned every aspect of forestry management through the entire life cycle. And coming to Ontario, where my children were educated, they have a very different perspective from their school on what forestry means. There's a very negative connotation that can come with forestry. And so, just those subtle differences in education may not sound like they're so different, but they can make a big difference in terms of how people relate to the subject matter of a particular project. Also feeding into culture and history are the Indigenous treaties that apply to the particular area. For example, when I started researching the historical Indigenous treaties in the area of Dryden and Ignis, I found Treaty 3 and I thought, well, there's got to be more than this. And the reason for that is that in my area where I call home, there are many, many Indigenous treaties. And it's very indicative of the relationship that Indigenous people in this area had with the Crown and how that may vary when you move into an area like Dryden or Ignis. And of course, historical land use also plays a huge role in how people see the world. I want to touch a little bit on relationships. And in this context, I'm really referring to how groups and individuals see themselves and other people and other groups. One of the things that will make for a strong community is that people can come together and have conversations. And I really like the environment that has been set up by Tyler and Marshallina in order to provide a safe space for those conversations to occur. Because without conversation, you really just get division in your community. And division, in my experience, has rarely helped people move forward. A recommendation that I would make in the context of projects is that people consider associating with one or more people or groups who have a different ethnic background, economic status, gender identity, or opinions on different subjects. It will help you bring something new to conversations that you participate in the future. And it just makes for a richer experience in terms of community. Continuing what I said earlier regarding sort of the political climate, economic development is always one of the forward topics when discussing energy projects. The first thing that politicians often think about is, what economic development will this project bring to my region? What jobs, what business opportunities are out there? The interaction of the municipal, provincial, and federal governments is very, I want to say, complicated. I don't know that it's a very good word to describe the situation. At the municipal level, the municipality has certain rights, responsibilities, and authorities. The provincial government has another very different set, and the federal government has yet another set. And sometimes there is conflict. You know, a number of years ago, there was a shipment that was potentially going to be made in southwestern Ontario that was under the purview of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And local municipalities would talk about things like, well, we'll deny a road permit to this shipment. Under the legislation, it really wasn't clear that the municipality had the right to make that decision. And so sometimes these interactions, which seem very clear or possible, often aren't. And what typically ends up happening, where there's a lot of animosity or friction there, is all the parties concerned end up in federal court. And that is a very, very time-consuming process. The final question that often comes up when you're talking about economic development and political climate is how different groups benefit from services. In the last session, where we spoke more directly about the Deep Geological Repository, we talked about, there were some questions about things like, what are the emergency plans? What are, you know, how will emergency staff respond? That sort of thing. Whenever a big project comes to town, there's always the potential for bigger, better hospitals, bigger, better emergency services, that sort of thing. And it's definitely something that the community has to, or should, think about when committing to something that is going to be a long-term energy project. In terms of public consultation, there is a requirement to consult with public stakeholders for any nuclear project. There are similar processes under the Canadian Energy Regulator, which focus more on, for example, chemical or oil and gas type projects. And for this public consultation, there is the opportunity to access participant funding. And what this allows is, it allows folks to attend hearings, potentially, to have an equal opportunity to provide input. And the programs are offered both by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the independent regulator, and also by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And I would encourage folks to look into these opportunities. One thing I will point out is, accepting money from these processes or funds does not imply that you must support the project that's being put forward, particularly you know, in cases like we have here with the DGR. So I would encourage folks to look into these funding opportunities, because you want to be an informed community. You know, regardless of the perspective that's taken, you know, if the opportunity is out there to participate and to have your voice at least being heard, whether you support or oppose the DGR, this is an opportunity where you can get your voice out there. And the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission records, so if, for example, if you send a written submission, those are posted on the internet for anyone to read. And it's an opportunity to be able to put your concerns and views out there. I also want to speak about Indigenous consultation. Canada's Constitution recognizes the status of Indigenous communities as nations within a nation and commits the Crown to meaningful consultation when projects impact the traditional territories of Indigenous communities. And recently, there has been more discussion on reconciliation, and Indigenous consultation processes can certainly assist with the reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. One of the concerns that was brought up at the previous session is that the communities that will get a say are potentially very small. They represent a percentage of the population in Northern Ontario. And the consultation that may occur once the NWMO does apply to the CNSC for a license, for example, may not be held directly in Dryden. It may be in an adjacent community. Engaging with Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners now will provide that forum and the relationship that can be built on in the future to advance, positions that might be mutually beneficial. One reference that I did want to provide here is from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission page. And on that page, you can find resources such as the participant funding program, regulatory documents that lay out the requirements of what must be covered during consultation. And I would encourage folks to have a look there. I also wanted to leave with some opportunities for positive engagement. I mentioned already the participant funding programs that are available. And I also wanted to point out a standards development opportunity. In Canada, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, upon issuing operating licenses, will often reference standards that have been written by the Canadian Standards Association as conditions. So for example, a common license condition is that when systems that are pressurized, so they may have pumps and tanks and valves and piping, they have to meet the requirements of a very specific Canadian Standards Association document. The Canadian Standards Association is currently developing a standard for deep geological disposal for radioactive waste and irradiated fuel, and the standard is open for public comment. What that means is everyone on this call can see the standard's full text and can submit comments on the technical and other content in the standard. And I've listed the link there that will bring you to the Canadian Standards Association page housing the standard. So I would encourage folks to at least look at what some of the early work being done in this area is made up of. Far in the future, if we could look out 10 to 20 years, if we did have a DGR with an operating license, these are the requirements that the CNSC would likely impose. And these standards are often prepared by a committee of industry and public citizens. And so I would encourage you to take a look. Does anyone have any questions?
Some really great points there, Kim. I did post in the chat some of the access to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's hearings for nuclear sites. That first link I think is interesting because you can go and look at what these hearings might be. They're full transcripts generally. So they are quite interesting, and also maybe a good source of additional information as well for people who are interested, as there are previous waste facilities that have gone through some of these types of processes. And then I also put a link for the CNSC participant funding program. So great points, Kim.
Great, thank you, Larkin. I appreciate that.